this Get Real webinar today. Before we get started, just a few of the usual reminders. If you're calling in from a location with background noise, please mute your phone if you haven't. Avoid using your cell phones or cordless phones if possible, and call in from a landline. Try not to use your speaker phones because there's background noise. And if you're having a sound quality issue, hang up, dial back in. Sometimes that clears up the problem. I think the rest is pretty much covered. This is a webinar that's going to be recorded as always, and it will be up on our website afterwards. At the end of this particular webinar, we will have a question and answer period. I will explain how that's going to work in a minute, but it's going to be different than our prior webinars. This will be the first time we have an option to do some interactive conversation with each other. And after the webinar, you're going to get a follow-up email with a survey. Please, if you can, fill it out, send it back to us. Your responses really help us and continue to support the work that we do and the planning that we do for future webinars. So, on this webinar, it's important that you have entered an audio PIN number. The reason being because we're going to open it up for conversation like on a regular conference call where people have interactive conversations. If you have not entered an audio PIN, you can do it now by going to the GoToWebinar window and pressing on your phone the pound sign, the 2-digit audio PIN on your window, and the pound sign again. So if you have trouble doing that, please use your chat function instead and just send us messages through that function. So you will both be able to have interaction on the call itself or sending questions on the chat function. We'll be able to cover everything that way. So we're very pleased today to have Robin McCallan from True Colors Incorporated in Connecticut joining us to present on this webinar. Robin is the founder and executive director of True Colors Incorporated. She's also a co-author of several books and articles on LGBT youth concerns. She's received numerous awards, including most recently the 2014 Human Rights Campaign Upstander Award for Leadership in LGBT Issues. Other awards she's received are the 2011 Provost Award for Excellence in Public Engagement, the 2008 National Education Association Virginia Uribe Award for Creative Leadership in Human Rights, in 2008 the NASW Connecticut Chapter's Social Worker of the Year Award. We're honored to have you, Robin. Welcome and thank you.
Great. Thank you so much, Bill. I really appreciate it. I'm very excited to be here. For those of you who don't know True Colors and what we do essentially do education and advocacy for gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, intersex, queer, questioning, two-spirit, same-gender loving, pansexual, sexual, not straight, not labeling, straightish, straight so far, straight with options, straight but stuff happens, gender bending, bi-gendered, pan-gendered, agendered, asexual, and other sexual and gender minority youth. And I don't have any expectation that you'll remember any of that. One of the reasons I always start with the litany of the language before I get into any of our conversations is really because the language keeps changing and how young people are describing themselves and their experiences really is changing a lot, and that it's most of the words, what they have in common is that they're identifying this kind of fluidity in both sexual identity and gender identity and expression. So I just sort of like to lay that out there as a framework as we continue conversation. True Colors has a number of programs. We do professional training and consultation. We do a lot of policy and advocacy work both at the individual level and at the state and occasionally at the national level. We have an annual conference, which is the largest LGBTQI, ABCDEFG conference in the country, and for youth. And then we have an annual resource guide. I'm going to tell you more about the mentoring and leadership program as we talk about the Safe Harbor Project. And so what this webinar is going to focus on, really the first half is going to focus on the Safe Harbor Project, which is a public-private partnership between True Colors and the Connecticut State Department of Children and Families. That partnership began in 2001. I'll tell you a little bit more about the history in a minute, but there's been some really amazing advantages of the partnership and some interesting challenges, and so I'm looking forward to the opportunity to both put it out there for folks to see it as a model and also to get feedback on the model. And then at the second half of the program, we're going to spend a lot more time talking about trans youth, gender creative, gender nonconforming, and transgender kids. Because my experience after having done this for about 25 years is that more and more often the issues surrounding LGBT youth are more focused on gender and the extent to which they fit neatly into boxes for masculinity and femininity, and that within congregate care facilities and within the child welfare arena, gender nonconforming children or teens are the ones that we often have the most difficulty meeting their needs. So let's jump into the Safe Harbors Project. So the mission of the Safe Harbor Project is to ensure the safety, support, and nurturance of all children and youth, regardless of their sexuality, gender identity, or expression. And we do that by working to ensure culturally competent, unbiased, and affirming service by the Connecticut State Department of Children and Families, all of their staff members, but also all of their contracted providers. The components of the program include training. We do about 16 to 20 trainings a year that focus on DCF workers, foster parents, providers, so it might be group home folks. We do both day-long things and shorter-term training in different offices, and we do several of the trainings are statewide, so that we come into the DCF Training Academy, and both workers and providers can come to those. We also have a component of the Safe Harbor Project that does foster parent recruitment, especially within the LGBT and affirming communities, to specifically to find foster homes for teenagers, regardless of their sexuality or gender identity, though we most often focus on LGBT teens as the kids that we most often recruit for. That's an interesting project because we recruit, but we don't train and license. So we then send the people that we recruit into different of DCF's providers or DCF themselves to be licensed often for a particular kid. And I can answer questions about that later if you have it. We also do a statewide task force, and so the task force meets monthly. We focus on policy, programming, and intervention. We've written policy guides. We've written, and I'll tell you when we go through the history, that we were responsible for DCF adding sexual orientation and adding gender identity and expression to their non-discrimination policies long before we added them in the state. The other exciting part about the Safe Harbor Project is that we have Safe Harbor liaisons in every DCF office. In Connecticut, there's 13 regions, and each region has its own office, and there's a Safe Harbor liaison in each office. There's a Safe Harbor liaison in each one of their facilities, which is the residential treatment facilities as well as the juvenile training, which is the jail or detention center for boys and the one for girls. And so the liaisons, their role is to serve as a conduit for resources when an issue comes up with another social worker and a kid that they're looking for resources for, they're looking for a family for, they're looking for support for the caregivers for, that the Safe Harbor liaisons receive some special training to be able to provide that information, or they also serve as a conduit to True Colors so that we can come out and do case consultation on individual cases. And we do a lot of policy and program recommendations, and I'll tell you more about that when we get to get a little bit later on. So just a little quick history of the Safe Harbor Project. It actually, back in 1993, I was getting my master's at UConn School of Social Work, and the first year of the program, for my field work, I did a project that explored the resources that are available for LGBT people in Connecticut. And Connecticut's a pretty small state. And we found in doing that needs assessment survey, what we found was that there were almost 100 organizations that supported LGBT adults. However you might slice and dice a community, there was a group for it. So if you were interested in antique cars, there was a gay group for antique cars. If you were a gay Catholic, there was a group for that. If you were a gay Jew, there was a group for that. That whatever organizations or different ways that the adult community existed, there were lots of support systems for them. But in the whole state, there were only 2 programs for youth. So I proposed to the university for the second year of my fieldwork that I would do a conference on the needs of LGBT youth, especially in child welfare and in schools. And in Connecticut at the time, there were only 4 gay-straight alliances. Each of those gay-straight alliances, 3 of the 4 were in private independent schools, and 1 was in a public school. So there really was so very little support. So the very first conference, which was held in 1994, was called Children from the Shadows. When we organized it, we thought children are more fundable than teens, and they're not in the shadows. They're sort of out of the shadows. They're from the shadows. And we spent a lot of time trying to come up with a name that we thought would be something that would intrigue people. And because I'm a community organizer rather than a clinician, that a lot of the work I did in organizing the conference was to reach out to the stakeholders that were responsible for the health and well-being of youth. And one of those stakeholders was the Department of Children and Families. And so right from 1994, they have been a supporter of the conference, paying the registrations of any worker or provider or foster parent or youth that wants to go. And so we had been working with them from 94 up until about 2000 or so, just working on the conference. And just for a little heads up on True Colors, we were only supposed to do the conference, supposed to be a one-time thing. But the young people that helped organize it and I were just so transformed by the experience that we decided to keep on going. So we started to do some work with gay-straight alliances, and actually in Connecticut now there's 168 gay-straight alliances. So there's been a sea change over the years. We started working with the Department of Children and Families and others, and so we got our, we incorporated, we got our 501c3, and now we're a statewide agency. But just specific to the Safe Harbors Project. So Children from the Shadows happened, and then Lambda Legal started doing Lambda Legal Education and Defense Fund in New York, who we had been working with around some of the LGBT youth and child welfare concerns, did a 14-state analysis of the needs of this population of young people in out-of-home care. And the publication that they put out was called Youth in the Margins. Connecticut was one of the 14 states, and what they noted was that although we were sort of ahead of the curve in some areas, there were some areas in which we were really lacking. And so Susan Sommer, who was the key author of that, of the Youth in the Margins, and I met with the commissioner at DCF, and that was how the Safe Harbor Project sort of came into being. It was in response to that information, and then they funded us to start doing the work, especially around training and the task force. And the first thing we did as a task force was to propose to DCF to update their non-discrimination language to include both sexual orientation and gender identity and expression, as well as intersex. And so in 2002, DCF updated their policies with those non-discrimination clauses. I tell you, we were able to do some things with the policy as it was set up. Until the law changed in 2011, there weren't a lot of teeth in the policy. So that was, one of the challenges. But the policy existed, and we were able to use the policy when we were doing training and helping people look at the difference between their personal values and their professional responsibilities. Excuse me, I'm just choking a little bit, so I had to take a drink. Hold on a second. So we were able to use the policy to move some of the training and the programming forward. In 2005, we launched our mentoring program. And right now we're one of the very few mentoring programs in the country that works explicitly and almost exclusively with LGBT youth in out-of-home care, that matches LGBT youth in the system with LGBT and ally adults in the community. And that program has really evolved a lot over the since 2005. We are now DCF's largest provider of mentoring, and we have just under 100 kids in the program. And then lastly, in the history, in 2009, True Colors and partnered with Lambda Legal and the National Association of Social Workers and the Child Welfare League of America to create a training called Moving the Margins, which was designed really to train. We trained 40 master trainers around the country to use a values clarification and skill building training with social workers and other providers so that they can provide more culturally competent care to the youth that they serve. And then we've just been sort of moving along with the same issue since then. There's been some wonderful things that have been part of having this Safe Harbor project, having this really public-private partnership. I think one thing that's been really outstanding is the liaison program, because when there's an issue in the office, the liaison can often be on top of that, and that they can provide support, they can provide resources, they can also help provide some oversight, if that's maybe the word, if some worker is not doing what they need to do in terms of supporting a youth or an LGBT foster parent or adoptive parent. So the liaison program has been probably one of the key points, the key successes of the program. And in early October, we're relaunching that in a new way where we're providing some additional training twice a year to all the liaisons and sort of upping the requirements. And so we're kind of excited about what might happen with that over the course of the next year. I think comprehensive training has been a real value of the program because we've been able to train literally thousands of social workers over the course of the years. I think that's both a success and a challenge because initially the training was mandatory, which I think was really helpful. Over the course of the years, as the training demands change and you know, the culture changes and so on, the training is no longer mandatory but optional. And so, you know, one of the challenges of having training that's optional is that often you are talking to the people who either have an LGBT youth or foster parent on their caseload and are therefore very invested in, you know, finding out information or learning new skills, or people who've already got it and are interested in just like building their skills. The people who are really struggling or don't get it or don't want to get it often will self-select out of the training, and so that's something that we're working on for 2015 to try to make it bring some elements of the training back into a mandatory place. And one of the ways that we're doing that is by developing an online training so that the LGBT 101 can be handled online and that people can do that in their own time, you know, and at their own space, but that, you know, it would be required that within this time frame everybody do that training. I think we've also had successes with policy in getting policies that effectively look at and require a level of cultural competency for people who are working with young people and working with foster parents. That's on the other side of that coin, though, is that, you know, it's a bureaucracy and it moves really slowly. They've had in their legal department for almost a year now a comprehensive set of practice guides for working with transgender youth, and we can't seem to shake it out of the legal department. So it's a bureaucracy, and things move really slowly. I think the other piece that I just want to mention before we move on from the Safe Harbor Project is the issue around public advocacy constraints. That when you've got a private-public partnership like we have and a contractual arrangement, that contractual arrangement also puts some constraints on the ways in which we can, as True Colors, as an education and advocacy organization, the ways that we can advocate on behalf of our kids publicly. Individually, and as you know, in terms of individual kids, we have a lot of ability to advocate. So, for example, last Friday, one of our young people, DCF, sent her to live with her dad in Florida, somebody that she hadn't seen in 10 years or something, and then was sort of surprised when the placement blew up within 10 days. So this kid was now in Florida, had turned 18. She was a voluntary case. Her father had the police come and remove her. She was homeless. She had no money. She had no food, and it was raining, and her social worker wouldn't answer the phone. So she called us, and we were able to, because of our relationship internally within DCF, to call somebody who could do something right then. And so we called into the commissioner's office. We talked to the ombudsman that we have a relationship with, and she called the regional administrator, who then got the social worker, and we got this kid both a place to stay and some money and some food, and ultimately the next day we're able to get her flown back to Connecticut and back in care. So individually, there's incredible amounts of advocacy that we can do behind the scenes. Publicly, there's not a lot of advocacy that we can do sometimes. So many of you may have heard or read about one of our kids that's been in the news lately. She's a kid we've been working with for a long time, but haven't been able to say anything publicly in spite of a lot of myth and misinformation that's out there because of our relationship with her. And so one thing that I recommend is, as people put together these kinds of partnerships, that they also have in their back pocket relationships with other advocacy organizations, and there's many, so that when a situation comes up, that we can call in people like GLAD or Lambda Legal, or the Child Advocate, or other folks who can then do some of the public things that we can't do. So, and then we're going to go to questions and answers a little bit later. And if you've got questions about this project and what we've done so far, I would love to hear those. I want to shift the conversation to talking about trans youth. And the reason I want to shift the conversation is that I think that our experiences, and that many other folks may share the same experience, that in the child welfare system seems least able to effectively meet the needs of gender nonconforming kids in all the different ways that might exist. So we know that LGBT youth in general have experiences and behaviors that put them into higher contact with the system. So kids who don't receive support are more likely to have issues at school, more likely to have issues at home. They're more likely to be truant. They're more likely to run away, to use substances, to sexually act out. And all of those behaviors and experiences put them in contact with the system at higher rates. Once they get into the system, we know that the system doesn't do, generally speaking, a really good job at managing and culturally and competently caring for LGBT youth just in general, that they're often seen as the problem, and that if other kids are having an issue with their identity, they're the gay kid or the trans kid is the problem. They, if you look at the research, they have significantly higher rates of placement. There was an interesting study that came out recently that looked at the impact of multiple moves on intact families whose one or more parents were in the service. And so they looked at these families where the kids are not in crisis, that these are, regular intact families, and what is the impact of the ways in which they move so frequently around the country or across the world. And one of the things they found was that after about 7 moves, that even really well-adjusted kids began exhibiting symptoms of difficulty, whether it was depression, anxiety, lower grades, and other things. the LGBT youth in the system, and especially trans youth in the system, often have significantly more than 7 placements, and they're kids who are coming into it with a number of issues of trauma and harassment and abuse and mental health issues. And, I was working with one kid last week. She literally has had 41 different placements since she came into care as a 5-year-old, as a gender nonconforming 5-year-old. And so I think that that's a huge issue. I think that staff with unexamined biases or belief systems is a huge issue. Very often the people who spend the most time face-to-face with our young people, so the people in group homes, the youth officers in detention centers, foster parents, and so on, that the people who spend the most time with our kids often have the least amount of training in how to do that. And so one of the things that happens is that people parent these kids as they were parented, for better or for worse, and often it's for worse. And the issue I want to focus on for trans kids is placement and other treatment issues are especially complex, especially within the juvenile justice and residential treatment arenas. I also, you notice I've been using the word trans, and I've been using the word trans because I love the asterisk that it gives young people the ability to describe themselves. Since transgender and trans is a global term that can mean many different things, trans with an asterisk allows people to say, this is how I define myself. For example, transgender, gender nonconforming, gender creative, gender queer, gender fluid, bi, gender, pangender, transsexual, F to M, M to F. So it gives them the opportunity to say, this is who I am and this is how I want you to see me. Some of the things that we've been thinking about in terms of systemic interventions, and this one we open it shortly to questions and comments. I would love to hear more about the systemic interventions that you've been using. But so just laid these out gently. So first, comprehensive non-discrimination policies and practices. I think that, right now there's 21 states that have sexual orientation written into their non-discrimination language, and there's 17 states that have gender identity and expression written into their non-discrimination language. What that means is that there are, that number minus 50, or that number from 50 of states, 29 states that don't have sexual orientation, and 32 states that don't have gender identity and expression. So sometimes the state laws or the state statutes are not going to be supportive, and you have to look at other places. So some people have used sex discrimination laws at the federal level. Some people have used child welfare values and policies and practices as their means of using, creating non-discrimination that's explicitly inclusive of LGBT youth and foster parents. But so I think that it's a really important first step for people to figure out what is your existing non-discrimination laws and what's their impact and what could you use. The other thing I think that we're finding is that you need concrete, clear policies, but the policies need to be really flexible so that you can adapt them for the needs of this particular youth. Because there's so much diversity among youth in general, and certainly among trans youth and LGBT youth, that having the ability to make choices that are in the best interest of that youth, and to be able to modify policies based on the best interest of that youth can really make a difference. Some of the unique concerns that we're addressing, that probably others are too, is placement issues. So if you are a trans person or trans youth and your sexed body doesn't match your affirmed gender or your gender identity, do you go into a group home that is based on your genitals or your gender? And too often the answer is genitals, which then obviously has huge ramifications for identity development, safety, well-being, and other things for trans youth. There's unique concerns in detention, and we've just recently started working, since the beginning of this year, have started working very specifically with, in Connecticut, it's called Connecticut Court Support Services Division, which is the division that works with youth in detention. And detention and probation is pre-adjudication. There's also jails, which is a different part of the organization, and we haven't worked with Manson, which is the federal jail for boys, although we've worked with CJTS, which is the juvenile program for boys. Some of the unique concerns that trans kids have are around body maps. So when a kid comes into detention, the first thing that happens is people do a body map, which looks at scars and tattoos and other things on their bodies that can be used for identification. That, for any kid, that's a hugely invasive procedure. For a trans kid, you can imagine what that might be like. And then we have found in Connecticut a real big difference between F to M, so children who are male to female versus children who are female to male. So we have a number of incidences where children who were born male but are affirmed females have been placed in female units, and we have no circumstances in which a child who was born female was placed in a male program. And that obviously is a violation of Connecticut statute, and we're not sure that's an area that we're working on, because the state is framing that as a safety issue, and we know from various lawsuits and so on that you can't use safety, you can't use isolation and other things to protect kids. You have to have, the system has to be safe. Training is a critical issue, and when we look at training needs to be really everybody. That we've had gals or our guardian ad litems. We've had guardian ad litems who've been wonderful and some that have been not so great. I had a judge a couple of weeks ago say to a transgender kid, the social worker asked the judge to use the child's female name and pronoun, and the judge said, well, he doesn't look like a girl. So obviously, at each level, there's places where training is really important. And I won't spend any time on it now, but I will tell you that we have the trainings that we've developed is really set up as a Part 1 and in Part 2. Part 1 focuses on values clarification, definitions, basic elements of cultural competency, and then Part 2 is really skill building. An individual training, a one-time training, is probably the least effective way to change a system. That you need to have the conversation going over multiple sessions, and over, it has to be sort of incorporated into the culture of the organization. Okay, the last piece before I throw it open to questions and answers is the other systemic piece that really needs to be engaged in the conversation is keeping or getting youth back home. Okay, thank you. They muted me, so maybe that was a thing to stop. So let me just say this last piece with this is that, we know that the #1 predictor of outcome for kids is the response of their families. And so the more we can do to help families as their kids come out, the better the outcome for the kids. So I'm going to stop there and throw it open to questions and answers. Bill, you're going to unmute everybody? Everybody? Wow. Yeah. I don't know what that was. So people are unmuted.
Yeah, if you have your phones with background noise, please mute them. We're unmuting everybody so we can have this conversation right now. I'll let you know in a minute when we've got everybody unmuted.
And I know I went really fast. I was trying to get a lot in a short period of time.
Yes, you were. Okay, it looks like we have everything.
Jerry? Robert Jones from AT&T. Okay. Robert Jones from AT&T.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Jerry. Okay, how are you?
I haven't actually heard any questions.
I believe so, yeah.
Bill, have you gotten questions?
No. Did somebody have a question
Correct.
or comment?
All right, well then
And
why
I'm
don't we
aware
just
of that, right.
why don't we move on to this opportunity for people to share their own stories. So what are you doing that's working, that's making a difference, or that, especially, I'm very interested in what's going on out there in terms of transgender or gender nonconforming kids. Does anybody want to jump in?
Well, absolutely, and we're already involved, kind of, but not in an obvious, so obvious way. So the community.
Jerry's not aware that he's talking on the phone.
I'm not hearing anything. What's going on out there?
Well, apparently not too much. Is everybody able to hear? And we do a check.
I am here. Can you hear my voice?
That was
I can hear your voice now.
Hi. So this is Melissa Geiger. I'm a family advocate in San Francisco County. I work with family builders. And I'm curious, a question about what interventions you have found to be the most helpful with these kids in the system, especially with families, foster families in particular, that are religious, very conservative, and not accepting of the kids. And then I'm also just curious, it sounds like you've made a lot of progress in terms of progress or policy development. So, and in San Francisco, there seems to be, there's a big focus on CSEX right now. That's sort of the hot issue, and the LGBTQ issues, I think, are viewed a little bit as fringe issues at the moment. So have you dealt with anything like that? And if so, how have you moved through that and really impacted change?
Okay, wait a minute, Melissa. I missed a piece of what you said that you were saying. So I got the first part, and then the second part, the second question about, there was a middle part. So could you say the second question? How are we moving through this?
The second question is in regards to policy development. So I'm on the internal task force, the LGBTQ task force in San Francisco, and there's not a lot of involvement from leadership at this point. So it's hard to get past systemic change without getting leadership involved.
Right.
And I'm curious if you've seen similar issues and how you've moved through them, if so.
Okay. All right. So let me start with the question about working with families that are not accepting. One of the tools that we have found that's been very helpful has been the Family Acceptance Project. The research that Caitlin Ryan did at the Family Acceptance Project, and we've used their brochure, and we've used a number of short videos. There's an organization called Global Dialogues that's doing some really interesting international work around sexuality. And they've got two dialogues that we've been using. One focuses on a family in Guatemala, and one focuses on an African family. And the African family focuses on religion, although it comes up in the Guatemalan one as well. And that what we found is that first of all, it's a process. Number one, well, let me say this first. Foster parents have less often investment in doing this work than bio families or kinship care, because foster families in Connecticut and in states other than California really get to choose whether or not who they want in their home. California has is one of the few states that really requires foster families to not discriminate on the basis of sexual orientation and gender identity expression. So it's definitely challenging with foster parents. One of the things that we've been able to do with them is to work with their social workers and their clinicians, take them through a process that recognizes, number one, that they don't have to transform themselves and their values to make room for this kid, to support this kid. You know, Caitlin's research makes it really clear that although support and affirmation is best, leads to the best outcomes, ambivalence also provides a much better set of outcomes than rejection. So there's some behaviors that we can talk with people about in terms of, you know, the language that they're using, the usability to interact with a community, the parents' willingness to intervene on their behalf if they're being harassed or picked on, and then starting with the family around what were the values that you grew up with around this? How do those values play out for you today? What religion is important to you, and what's that religion's perspective on gay, lesbian, bi, and trans youth? Are there ways in which your religion can be used to support people? And that, you know, so that there's a lot of questions and conversations. I can actually, if you'd like, and if Bill, this would be useful, we set up a series of questions to ask parents that social workers and clinicians can ask parents to help them through the process of moving closer, moving off of rejection and towards ambivalence. Partly, it's letting them express their feelings and letting them talk about what they grew up thinking and believing and how their own values have changed over time, and how do they, you know, what are they willing to do to make some room for this kid. And if they're not willing, then, you know, we need to pull the kid. But if they are willing, there's lots of things that we can do, and it's a process, so it's not something that happens immediately. In terms of the policy and leadership, that's definitely a hard question. That I think that part of what we've done that has been helpful, and because we've been doing this for a really long time, that we've developed relationships with people in the child welfare system at various levels. And so finding a way to, you know, we meet at least once or twice a year with the commissioner to talk about where things are. New York just came out with a fantastic policy guide called Safe and Respected that was approved and set up by their leadership. So I think it's really about developing relationships, figuring out who in the system is likely to be an ally. And some of the people that are likely to be an ally are if you've got an adolescence bureau, and I don't know how in San Francisco the child welfare system is set up, but if they've got a bureau that's specific to adolescents, that's often a great place to start because they already know a lot about adolescent development, and that they're often easier to connect with. If you have DCF or child welfare offices in your community, to go visit them, especially the foster parent people and the adolescent workers. Find out if you can make a presentation to at their staff meeting, and that work on building, hold a community. We did a lot of community forums for a while of bringing people, foster parents and other parents in to talk about the needs of this population and inviting people from the child welfare system to sit in. So, Melissa, I don't know if that is too long-winded an answer or if that covered, you know, do you have a follow-up, backup, or a comment?
No, it's great to hear, and yes, I feel like as you're saying all of that, it just sort of reaffirms. It's like, okay, I'm actually on track. It's just you know, it's a slow process.
It is a slow process because they're bureaucracies and they don't turn easily. And that sometimes, you know, who else has been really great for us is the ombudsman, and that whoever is in the system that's designed to be the person that kids can call if they're if they feel discriminated against, or if something's not working for them, that they can often be somebody, and they're often in the commissioner's office. So they have access to some of the decision makers.
Hi, Robin.
Great, thank you.
Robin, it's Bill.
Yep.
Will you be able to share the series of questions with us?
Sure, I will.
Network?
I'll send it to you, and then you can put it on the
we can put it on the website and send it out to folks. That would be very helpful.
Sure.
And a reminder, excuse me, a reminder, folks, please put your phones on mute. If you're logged in using the computer mic, mute it. It keeps the background noise down. And if you want to ask a question, then just unmute the computer.
I also wanted
So
just before we...
Somebody sounds like they're typing. So
Somebody typing.
Could you mute your computer, please? If you're typing or stop typing. Thank you. A question came in for you,
yeah.
Robin, and the question is, they're curious about what your staffing capacity and structure looks like to support the ongoing training, policy work,
Right.
et cetera.
Right. We are an incredibly overworked staff of 5. So we, even I'm the executive director. I'm supposed to be doing executive director things, and I probably train 6 or 8 hours a week. So we've got a mentoring coordinator, a youth activities coordinator, because we also do weekly social and recreational programming for LGBT youth in the community and in the system. And we have a volunteer coordinator. We use volunteers a lot for lots of things. We do all of our mentors are volunteers. We have office volunteers. The conference is essentially run by volunteers, and we just sort of help manage the process. So yeah, I think it's without our volunteers, we wouldn't be able to do anything that we're doing. But we have right now, we have 5 paid staff. And Connecticut's a small enough state that we can get to one end and the other, in 2 hours. So that system kind of works for us. Although
what
we would
about
like to have 2 more people.
Yeah. What about the liaisons? Are they volunteers or staff?
They're all volunteers. They're all volunteers.
Oh, okay.
And so they're social workers. Almost without exception, they're a social worker or a clinician in the office, in the particular office that they serve, and that they do this as a volunteer position.
Great. Thanks.
And I just want to go ahead.
Go ahead. No, go ahead, Rob.
I just wanted to say on the last page, the additional resources, there's a couple of things I just wanted to point out, which is the Safe and Respected, which is a really good policy from the Child Welfare in New York. The LGBT Youth in Foster Care is a great video from In the Life. It's a 27-minute video about youth in foster care. And then the Family Acceptance Project is there, as well as GLAD and Lambda and some of the other. Gender Spectrum does a huge amount of work with schools and gender non-conforming children, or gender creative children. So I just wanted to point those resources out to folks.
Great. Robin, can you talk a little bit about demographics of the youth you serve, and also whether or not the Connecticut system is beginning to gather information around LGBT youth?
Right. So the demographics of our kids in the system, kids in the system are, black and brown children are overrepresented in the system. Within the mentoring program, it's a little bit closer to, it's about 60% youth of color and 40% youth who identify as white. We found, right now we have a 50-50 in
I'm sorry, somebody please mute your...
we have a 50-50 in terms of male, female, and we've got about, of the 80 or 90 kids that we have, I think 5 are on the trans spectrum. That I think one of the challenges that we have is that mentors tend to be more white than people of color. That's been a challenge for us. Demographically, the kids sort of match the system. For a long time, social workers wouldn't prefer gay boys because of their own stereotypes about gay men. So we had a lot more girls than we had boys, and now it's about 50-50. In terms of counting our kids, we haven't been able to do that yet with DCF, and that's partly a systemic problem with the system that they use, and it's partly a resistance problem. The state of Massachusetts and GLAD just came out with a tool that's going to be implemented across their child welfare and juvenile justice programs that includes both sexual orientation and gender identity expression, questions, and sort of helping kids be able to bring their full selves into the intake procedure. It's really a fabulous tool, and if people can get that from GLAAD, or I think, Bill, I even sent you a copy of the original draft of that. I don't know if they've published the final version of that yet or not, because their press release on that was just last week. But we are not counting yet. I'm hoping that's going to happen relatively soon because it impacts our ability to provide services. At one point, we almost got an LGBT youth group home opened, but we couldn't prove that there were enough kids who needed a level 2 group home who identified on the LGBT spectrum to keep the group home full. Because in Connecticut, in order for a group home to break even, most group homes are 6 kids. They have to have 5.2 kids, in beds in order to break even. So if they're not full, they lose money, and we couldn't document a business case that showed that they would stay full because the DCF doesn't count the kids that are in it that identify as LGBT or T.
Great. Are there any other questions or comments? Okay. Well, Robin, thanks so much. This has been really informative. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And we will be sending out the series of questions when we get them, posting them on the website. And as you know, this is a webinar that is recorded. It will be on our website. We'll be able to share it with others, and others on the network will be able to access it as well. So thank you all. And again, thanks, Robin. This was really helpful.
Thank you very much. I really appreciate it.
All right.